Hey, welcome back. If you've come this far, you're ready to look into something a bit more complex. But before I show you how to do a group by, I feel like I need to explain a few things. In order to really make good use of a grouping, you need to begin by understanding functions, and specifically aggregation functions. So first off, let's take a look at what functions are. Functions are simply code that you can call from within your script and have them return something. For example, this function is called getDate, and as you might guess, it returns the current date. But I can't just run it as it is. You can see if I click execute, I get an error. Basically, SQL is confused as to what it's supposed to do with the getDate information. So it issues a syntax error. Well, we need to tell SQL Server to display the output of that function, and we do that with our old friend, the select statement. So it's like this. Now when I execute it, I get back the current date and time. There are multiple kinds of functions, and how you use them varies all over the place. We'll discuss them later in the series, but for right now, I just want to keep it simple and stay focused on where we're at. There is a special kind of function, or a set of kinds of functions, called aggregate functions. And they're special in that they aggregate all of the values in a column, assuming it's numeric, of course. And those aggregate functions, at least the common ones, include sum, average, min, max, and count. There are others, but for right now, those will give us enough to work on. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory. Sum adds or sums all of the values in your result set. So now earlier I said all of the values in a column, but let me modify that a bit. Really, the predicate of the where clause filters out some. So the aggregate functions do their work on what is returned from the filtered set of records. Average does what its name implies. It returns the average of those values. Min and max return the smallest or largest value in your set, and count simply tells you how many records there are in your set. Let's look at them in action. If I query the list price column from the production.product table, I get back all of the values for the individual records, and I can see that it returns 504 rows down here. If I use the count function like this, and I put the list price column in parentheses, and I execute it, it tells me what I really already know, but it's in a concise layout. And it tells me that there are, in fact, 504 rows, just like you'd expect. But notice there were a lot of zeros as price. So if I remove that count and do it again, notice that there were tons of records where the list price was 0. Let's put the count back in and modify it with a where clause. Taking care of my semicolon there, I'm just going to simply say where list price greater than 0. And now it's going to count for me how many records are returned from my where clause. I execute it. Now there are only 304 rows. You can guess how the others work, but let me just show you a few more. I can use the sum function. So if I sum the list price column, it returns this number. That's the value, the sum of all of the individual products' list price. I'm not sure that's very useful from a business point of view, but it does demonstrate how sum works. It might be more useful to see what our highest and lowest cost is. So I'm going to use max of list price and the min of list price. And again, I'm saying where list price is greater than 0 because we already know that would be the lowest. At least I hope it would be. If I click this now, I see the maximum value, the highest number, and the lowest number. I would certainly want to alias these. So I might say as highest price and alias this as lowest price. It doesn't really affect my outcome or my output, but it does leave you not having this kind of odd looking no column name. We already talked about aliases, you know that, and you know how to work with those. Finding the average price is maybe even more useful than all of those. So let's get rid of that. And I'm going to use the average function. And that's just abbreviated as AVG. And now when I execute this, I get my average price. Now this isn't formatted in dollars and cents, so it gets an odd looking thing here. But that's a price column. And that's the average of the price of my products. But notice there's a difference, and there obviously should be, when I average without zeros, and then I just leave that out, and I average all the values. So instead of $700 and some average price, it's now dropped way down because so many of my products are 0. But average introduces some complexity. And it's all based around something called null values, N-U-L-L, null values. So what are null values? Well, basically, a null value is what happens when someone inserts a record into a table and doesn't supply a value for one or more of the columns. They represent the absence of a value. They don't equal anything. Since they're no particular value, they represent a real difficulty for SQL Server because it doesn't know how to treat them. Comparing something to a null is kind of like asking if you would rather have an vanilla ice cream cone or a... And that's the problem. There isn't any way to answer that because you can't compare a vanilla ice cream cone to an unknown. I might have said a Mercedes, or I might have said, a jab in your foot with a sharp stick. There's no way to compare it if you don't know what the other thing is, and SQL Server runs into that same problem. There's no way to compare it. You can't have an answer when comparing something against an unknown. So when SQL encounters a null value, it has a very short way of working with it. It ignores it. It simply ignores the record with a null value in it when it comes to these aggregates. So let me show you a perfect example of this. In this case, I created a table called average demo that has exactly one column in it. It's a numeric column and its name is number. I'm not very good at coming up with creative names. So I already did this, and I already inserted into that table 5 records. Their values were 5, 5, 5, and 5. So if I select from that, if I see what's in that table, there you go. It's 4 records, each having the value of 5. So if I want to average that, that's pretty straightforward. I'll select the average of the number column from that table, and it comes up with a 5, no big surprise. And it got that, of course, by adding 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5, getting us 20. Dividing that by 4 gives us a 5. But what happens if I insert another row and I insert a null value? So I'm going to do that. And now let's look at it. If I select from the average of demo, I see I now have my original 4 records that were each 5 and a 5th record that is a null. All right, now what's going to happen? So I'm going to select the average of number just like I did before, but now there are 5 records and not 4. But the answer is the same. It ignored that null value. And so what it did was, once again, it did the same thing. Added 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 and divided by 4. Divided by 4 columns, not 5. If it had divided by 5, the answer would have been, of course, the average of 4. That's the problem with null values, and we really don't like null values. Sometime down the road, I'll show you how to deal with that issue. But for now, just be aware of it. That ignoring of null values also impacts all of the other aggregate functions. So I can use the count function and count the number of records in the that have a value in the number column. And it doesn't return 5 records because that 1 record is a null. It returns 4. I'm telling you, count, like all the other aggregation functions, ignore null values. But there's one exception to that, and that is if I use count star like this. And that's, if you think about what a select star means, it means select all of the columns. This is saying count those records that have columns in them. And in this one case, it does not ignore the null values. So instead of having a 4, it returns to me that there are 5 records. So count star defies the normal procedure, and it does return the number of records. Okay, so now that you have a good understanding of aggregates, we can start talking about the real group by function or clause in the next video. But before we finish, like always, let me leave you with a few practice exercises. First one is the straightforward exercise. Here, I'd like you to write a query that returns values and records from this view, the sales.vSalesperson view. And what I'd like you to return, you've used this before, this is familiar view to you, and I would like you to return the total of the sales last year column, the total of the sales year to date column, and then the average of the sales year to date column. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to use AdventureWorks, and I'm going to select, if I just do this, if I select sales last year, comma, sales year to date from the sales dot v salesperson view, then I get those two columns, but I get all the records. There are 17 records. What I want, though, is not the sales last year and sales year to date, but the aggregation. So I can just put a total of this, but total isn't the word I want. I want to sum the sales of last year. And then what I'd like you to do is do that same thing for sales year to date. So I get the sum of sales last year, the sum of sales year to date, and then a third column, the average of sales year to date. So I'm asking you to aggregate the values, and you probably ought to put on an alias on those just so that they actually look nice. So instead of saying no column name or sales last year, it would be the total sales from last year, or total of sales, something like that. Then finally, what I'd like you to do for your challenge exercise, that's going to be a little bit tougher. So what I want you to do there is I want you to look at another old friend in the tables world, and I want you to look at the human resources .employee table. Now, just to remind you, if I use AdventureWorks and select star from human resources .employee, and I execute that, it returns to me 290 rows and all of the columns. Here's the challenge. I want you to return to me the average of sick leave hours, over here, and the average of vacation hours, and the total for sick leave hours and the total for vacation hours, but only for those salaried employees who are males. And I'm not going to give you any more help on that. That's the challenge. So listen, enjoy that challenge. Have a great time with this. I hope you're appreciating how much you're learning. This is just tremendous stuff for you. As always, you know what I'm going to say. Subscribe and set notifications, like the video, do all those good things. And I will give you an answers video for this in a little bit. But for now, hope you're enjoying it. Do good and do good coding. Talk to you later. Bye.